Hello everyone, and welcome to Beyond the Playbook. We have a very special guest with us today. But before we get into that, do subscribe to our channel. If you haven't watched our previous video, we'll leave a link in the description. So do go check that out. Drop a like. It makes us feel, it encourages us to do better. So, for our guest today, she carries the legacy of her father Pele while forging her remarkable path. She's a dedicated activist working extensively in the realm of sports diplomacy and social development. She's particularly focused on promoting gender equality in sports and using storytelling to build community and trust. She's also the founder of the Nascimento Foundation. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Ms. Kely Nascimento. So, Ms. Nascimento, how
Hi.
does it feel to be on Beyond the Playbook?
It's very exciting. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So, let's get down. Let's start the interview. So, a basic question, a very general question. How would you
Gentle.
define
I'm scared
sports
now.
diplomacy? Sorry?
Say that again. I'm sorry. I said I'm scared now. Is this a gentle one? Is it going to get worse?
Yeah. Yeah. So, how do you define sports diplomacy, and why do you think it's a powerful tool for global change?
Um, I think sports diplomacy, and it's is just diplomacy, right? In a way, it is telling, in a very very basic way. I feel like it is telling your story through sports. If whether you're a country or a brand or an athlete or a brand that has nothing to do with sports, right? Or a federation. So how do you tell your story through sports? Period. Like I think, for example, in the '60s, and I don't think it is. And I always have this argument with some of my academic friends. I don't think it needs to be. I think it can be inadvertently, right? Because you will have an effect through sports, what even if it's inadvertent, right? So, for example, the United States right now has some of the most visible and biggest sports leaders, right, and personalities in the world. So I think today the United States is really, the sports diplomacy for the United States is the possibility to harness the diplomacy of sports to make change and create sort of some international um, bigger storytelling is really big, right? I think in the '60s, for example, it was almost like music diplomacy for Great Britain. Like Great Britain was largely seen through its music, also inadvertent. But like there was a great possibility for Britain in the '60s to create sort of conversations through like diplomatic exchanges and conversations through their music, through staging concerts in different countries, through things like that. So that's what I think diplomacy is. It's basically storytelling, right? How do you want to be seen? And then just to go a step further, what I work on, and my passion is to help you tell your story through sports as social impact. So how do you, if you are a company, for example, that is sponsoring some major game or wants to be somewhere that where wants to be sort of having international conversations with either another company, even if it's remotely or even tangentially associated to sports, how do you use then like sports programming and collaboration and sports for social impact and community impact programming to like reach out sort of like the fig leaf, right? So you go over to say Aramco. Aramco is FIFA's biggest sponsor right now. So Aramco
Yeah.
could very easily use their entire like corporate social responsibility budget to create sports for community projects everywhere that FIFA is going to have a presence. And so, like that. Sorry, that was a long winded explanation.
No, it's absolutely fine. Yeah. And what do you think, what power does sports diplomacy hold?
I think it holds like just immeasurable power. And I think it's interesting because so the Department of Justice in the United States has a small sports diplomacy department within it. And a lot of what they do is these exchanges where they have like we have so many Olympic athletes, right? Like we only think of the ones who won 10 golds, but we have thousands of Olympic athletes that are still living and still participating in programs and so they use the Department of Sports Diplomacy to create um, programs, sports for social impact programs that are aligned to policy. So in fact, so like basically, if there's a policy that they want to enact in wherever in the government with, say, Guatemala, this the sports diplomacy department, as part of the greater strategy and greater approach, right? It's just a small soft power. Is they will go and start, they'll reach out to Guatemala via the ambassador, I guess, and they'll start uh, possibly sending some athletes to do some appearances and to launch some
Mm.
programs that the much like US aid used to before it was dismantled, and hopefully it'll be back, soon. It's a soft power that garners good feelings towards the US, right? And then in a
Okay.
more sort of obvious and kind of exciting way, and where like recently it's been shown to be a very hard power, is, I don't know if you saw this recently, but Australia has committed 300 million dollars, Australian dollars, to create a um, rugby national rugby league for Papua New
Yeah.
Guinea
Mm.
in exchange for
Yeah.
them to not allow China to set up military bases on the island. Now that's a hard power, right? There's nothing between that hard power. It's not like helping to soften the blow. It is actually the power that it is using to in exchange
Mm.
for a true military action. So, I think it
Yeah.
ranges.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. So, can you share some inspiring examples that you think, that are where sports has helped bridge political or cultural divides?
I think it's hard to do that because up until now, with the exception of that, I mean, I know it has, and I know it does all the time, but up until
Mm.
now, with the exception of that uh, Australia example that I just gave, um, and it's always been, again, a soft power. It's always been sort of like part of the machine, part of the diplomatic machine, along with many other sort of soft power things, right? For example, because there's no evidence that has been recorded, although we know this happens, like even going back to the Olympic truce, right? Back in,
Mm.
like when the Olympics sort of began, where they established a truce where, during the Olympics, any feuding country or would have a ceasefire to allow safe passage for the athletes. To think that nothing happened during that time, that where there was a ceasefire, that there were no political negotiations, that didn't give time and allow for other political negotiations to happen, right, is naive. Like that is, you use the ceasefire, even if it's just because we're allowing athletes safe passage. So I think that in that way, sports diplomacy up until recently has been used in a supporting role. So I think it's very difficult to pick out like an instance. It's never been used by itself, in a trade.
Mm.
I
Mm.
think we're going to see it more and more, much like Australia. I think we're going to see it a lot more as
Mm.
sports takes center stage in a lot of our negotiations and a lot of our conversations. It is the new rock and roll. Athletes are the new
Mm.
superstars. So I think now, especially now that people see sort of the numbers behind a World Cup, the numbers behind a cricket World Cup, the numbers behind the T20 World Cup that they had here for the first time ever, right, in the United States, and
Yeah.
it was pretty phenomenal. So I think you're going
Mm.
to see it like acting as the main source of diplomacy for many things. But up until now, I don't think it has. So I think it's really hard to sort of pick something out. I wish I had a more sort of historical mind for this kind of thing. I think there may be people who you'll have on here in the future who can pick something out really fast.
Yeah. That's true. Yeah. So, as a woman in sports advocacy, what challenges have you faced, and how do you think sports diplomacy can empower women worldwide?
Um, so I think I don't think as a woman in sports advocacy, I don't know that I've faced any challenge that's different than women in any other male-dominated setting. I think that that's the thing with sports; it reflects the greater culture of whatever the sports represents, right? So and I think for me, especially coming as my father's daughter and coming as, I'm not a new young person coming into this, right? Like I think that I am also I sense obviously very often the very subtle but not so subtle sort of sidebarring of women when they speak in rooms full of men, but I am shown some deference out of just politeness. that that I think allows me to say things that gives me like a
Mm,
little bit more of a platform than I think the average young or even older woman would. And I try to use that, right? I try to use that because I almost feel like sometimes like this is not true. I have clients that can fire me, but for the most part, when I'm in these rooms, I'm not, my job is not on the line, and I'm not rude, but
mm,
I often have taken it to say things that other women probably cannot say. You know what I mean? And it's kind of empowers you to say things that other women can't say. It's kind of like using your privilege. You know how they say, when you're sort of like a, yeah. So that's how I use my privilege, is to try to say things that other women really can't say. And at my age and
mm,
my stage in my career, I'm able to say certain things. Um, but I think in terms of empowering women, I think just the fact that, for example, in the United States, I'm speaking now for like the World Cup is coming to the United States, right? 2026. There's a relative amount of difficulty in getting the believe it or not, the general public here excited about the World Cup. Granted, there's a lot happening in the
oh,
United States right now, and we all feel like
mm,
if we survive to 2026, we'll think about it then. But I don't think that we would have this hard a time for a women's World Cup in the United States. And that is the beautiful like difference in the United States. The way that soccer evolved in the United States, right, different from football in other countries, is that it was a women's sport first. Because when it came, it was rejected by most of the sports world here in the United States. The commentators didn't know how to comment on it. The advertisers didn't know where to put commercials. It was before like holograms and stuff, and they were like, "What? They run for 45 minutes? What are we going to do with that?" And so, Title IX had just been passed, and institutions that receive federal funding had to find more sports for women because American football took up so much money. So to make it even, they had to
mm,
find more
mm,
sports for women to offer. So everybody started offering soccer. So soccer became almost like a women's game in the United States. So the women's football or soccer in the United States is a much more powerful tool for diplomacy than men's, right?
oh,
So I think in that sense, like our women's national team is a much more prominent diplomatic front for us than the men's national team. And so I think in that way, in those ways, right, as women's sports grow and grow and grow, right now with the WNBA, like it's insane, right?
mm,
So that becomes a very powerful tool and centers women in the conversation, right? I think what we have to make sure that happens is that there are women making these decisions, that there are women using this power and not men using this power with women, right? Um, but I think those are the ways in which, and you see all, yeah, I think those are the ways. That's in one
yeah,
example, but yeah.
mm, mm,
I also think if FIFA, for example, with the Iranian stadium ban, right, there was a lot of pushback. There was a lot of public pushback, and I think FIFA was
mm,
actually very
mm,
good back when they had a game in Iran, and they actually sent people to FIFA representatives to be at the stadium gates to make sure that the section that had been allowed for women, because when FIFA doesn't always push for these things, and I understand because I don't understand. I mean, I don't think it's right, but I do understand why it happens because the president of FIFA, whoever it's going to be and whoever it is dependent on votes. So, it becomes like
yeah,
a very sort of special interest kind of thing, right? Enforcing anything, right? You have to be, I guess you have to decide if it's going to be worth it to you in re-election to enforce. With Iran,
yeah,
because of public pressure and because hopefully they will want to do the right thing, they did do some pushing. And so Iran opened up a section for women. But the general sort of belief was that they still weren't going to let women in. So FIFA sent people, like they sent people to be at the gates to make sure that women went in. And I think that that's sort of using sports to push change, and then that's also part of sports diplomacy.
yeah, agreed, yeah. So, you mentioned that, out of at times people might, let you speak out of politeness. So, do you think that's changing?
Say that again. I'm sorry.
I said, you mentioned that at times people might let you speak out of politeness. So, do you think that's changing in the future?
You mean that people let me speak out of politeness? You mean as opposed to?
Yeah, yeah.
No, I mean I didn't. I think that I get asked to speak plenty of times because of what I have to say. What I'm saying is that
Okay,
I
that's
had
good.
some privilege in
Mm.
some rooms that would otherwise not really listen to a woman.
Okay.
I
Mm,
think there are a
mm,
lot, and I don't think it's just my, I think there are a lot of people who get to this point in their
mm,
careers and in their lives where, you know, first of all, I they know I'm going to speak. You know what I mean? Like
mm,
people won't have me in a room. I think at this point, and just because of my personality, not necessarily because of who my father is or how long I've been in this business, but my
mm,
personality is such that, like, at this point, people know, like, if you don't want me to speak, don't invite me, right? So I think that once I'm in there, then I'm not, I'm going to have an opinion, um,
mm.
and I feel like if you invited me, it's because you want my opinion, right? So
Yeah. Yeah. Great. So, what advice would you give to young women who aspire to work in sports diplomacy?
So I think a couple of things. First of all, I think young women especially should lean on each other and find other women.
Mm,
Find your, it does not always have to be women, a lot of the time it is, but somebody told me this once. I think it was like, I don't remember who it was. It was a person who was a sports figure, and I probably should remember because it's make a much more interesting story. But she said, "Find your unicorns, right? Find the unicorns."
mm,
So it's find those people, those women, especially women, who are, who have gotten to a certain place. Doesn't have to be the top, but who are door openers, right? Find your spaces. Find, like, like in the U.S. There's so many more, not so many more, but there are some more organizations and people opening up opportunities. Like Women in Soccer is an amazing organization in the United States.
mm,
I also think that, learn your history, but as a woman also, I think you definitely have to find your people. And I think that you, even not as a woman, um, I think sports diplomacy is really, it's interesting because anything you do, anything that you're good at and that you love, and that, and I think sometimes when you're young, that's a daunting thing. For me, that was a daunting thing, because I was good at a lot of things. I wasn't a genius at a lot of things, but I was good at and liked a lot of things. And by, you know what I mean? I mean good. I'm not being pretentious. I wasn't brilliant at a lot of things, but I was very good and liked a lot. So there were a lot of things I could have done, and it was really hard for me when people said, "Find
mm,
your
mm,
passion." And it's really, and I think it's hard for a lot of people. You often find your passion through trial and error, and it takes years, right? Like, people don't wake up with their passion. Like, you see these people who knew they wanted to be a surgeon when they were 5 and now they're surgeons. That's very much not the norm. So what I
mm,
mean is, so go and find the things that you like and that you feel like you're good at. Meaning, like, that perfect combination of, like, okay, I wake up and I'm happy I'm doing this, right? I wake up and I don't dread getting up in the morning, and also I'm getting paid enough to, like, to live, and I see it as, you know, in the right direction, in the right general
mm, mm,
direction. Also, I wouldn't get too fixated on, like, a linear plan, like on the right general direction. Only because I think, especially in sports and especially in diplomacy, because it's such a non-specific field still. There's a lot of places you can be to get to diplomacy, right? And almost anything you're good at can be used in sports and in sports diplomacy. For example, what I do now within the consultancies that I work in, like in my own consultancy, both of them, right, that I work with partners, is I still do what I did when I was in the arts. I started out in the arts, right? I started out with branding and graphic design and photography. I went to an art school, right? And I'm a storyteller, and I still do that in sports diplomacy, right? So when we get a client, I come in and I'm like, all right, give me the client. I do like a whole sort of kind of breakdown of who they are, who they want to be, and what story they want to tell. And then we sit down and with our program directors and, like, okay, well, how do we build programs that help them tell the stories? Who do we connect them with that will be part of this story,
mm.
right? Will this decision tell this story better or deviate from this story? So I'm still telling stories. So I feel like,
Yeah.
and that seems pretty far from sports diplomacy, right? Graphic design at Parsons, right? So I think anything you do can be applied to sports, especially if you're a young woman. You have to see that, because young women don't necessarily, aren't necessarily encouraged to develop, like, a love for
Mm,
sports. And I think it's changing. I hope it's changing.
yeah.
So, even halfway through, if you're like 30 and you've been doing something completely different, like, it doesn't mean you can't find like what you do in a sports world and start, like, inching that way, whether it's by volunteering or shadowing or, going to Women in Soccer, place organizations like Women. I think there's a
Mm,
Women in sports, right? In Great Britain, I'm not sure, that does kind of the same thing. I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
I think, yeah.
Yeah, start attending workshops, start reaching out to people after. Like I had so many young women reach
Mm,
out to me after that women in soccer panel. Start making friends. LinkedIn is your friend. Not most people. I message tons of people who don't answer me. I don't take it personally. I think I don't look at my messages all the time on LinkedIn. There's so many platforms where people message me, like WhatsApp, Instagram, text, email. Like I
mm,
don't always look in LinkedIn. So don't take it personally. Don't be discouraged. There are people who take
mm,
months before they look at their LinkedIn messages, especially people who are established. But yeah, I
yeah.
think all of those things, like, get yourself in the middle and start talking to people.
Those were pretty great insights. Yeah, so next, your father Pele was an icon who transcended sports. So, how has his legacy influenced your approach to sports diplomacy?
Um, I think in retrospect, many ways, in many, many ways, actually, I had like a front row seat to like the soft power of sports diplomacy inadvertently by watching him walk into rooms and walk into, the goodwill that he always garnered in a time where there wasn't social media. He hadn't built a
Mm,
social media presence. It was
yeah.
just true. And I also understood the value of having uh, had a presence in people's lives, for throughout sort of big things that happen in their lives, right? I always noticed that my father wasn't necessarily my father that people were so passionate about. It was what he represented in their lives, right? The things about their lives,
Mm,
like when they watched his game, like that, it was a time in their lives like that. This is when their son was born, when they had their first kiss, when they graduated, when their dad passed. Till today, I have people like your age, right, and a little older than you, who come to me with tears in their eyes about how much their grandfather loved Pele and how much he talked about him and what that means to them to be meeting me. Because, do you know what I mean? And I think that he's not
yeah.
alone in that. I think there are people who get that. It's not about the person. It transcends the individual, right? But also, my father was and my father and my being in the United States, my being who I am today, and my father's entire like journey after his third World Cup was a product of sports diplomacy, right? So I don't know if you know this,
Mm,
but after he won after they won the World Cup in 1970, all these teams, Napoli, PSG, all came courting. They all wanted my father to come play for
okay.
them, and because we were a military dictatorship, the general or president at the time did not want my father to leave, so he made my
Oh.
father a non-exportable national treasure, so that he wasn't allowed to leave the country,
Mm-hmm.
and he didn't let him take any of those jobs. And then in 1974, this man named Steve Ross, who's the president of Warner Brothers, decided that, he wanted to make soccer like a thing in New York. He became passionate about it. He wanted to make he owned Warner Brothers owned the Cosmos, and he really wanted to make soccer a big thing in
Mm,
New York, in the United States. And he went to one of his music executives, who happened to be Egyptian, Ahmed Erdogan. He was the head of Atlantic Records, I think it was, or Columbia. Yeah, I think it was Atlantic, whatever Warner Brothers owned. And he said to him, like, who's the best in the world? Because he didn't know much about football. And Ahmed said, Pele's the best in the world. And he goes, okay, well, let's get Pele to come and play for the Cosmos. And Ahmed laughed and he's like, you're not going to get Pele to come and play for the Cosmos in New York City. It's like, you don't even have like, a stadium with grass. And he's like, no, but I want Pele. Let's offer him whatever he wants, right? And they reached out to my father and he said, no, thank you. He was tired, and he was happy, and he was not going to come. They didn't let him go to the teams that he wanted to. He wasn't going to come to a new place that didn't even have football, right? But this was a man, he was a very powerful, middle-aged white man in America, and he called the president of the United States, and he called Henry Kissinger, and he said, we really want him. Can you reach out to the Brazilian president and tell him it would be great for U.S. Brazil relations if he were to accept this offer?
mm,
And magic, he accepted the offer and he came to the United States.
yeah.
So those were all, you know what I mean? Everything that's brought me here to you today has to do with sports diplomacy. So I
Mm-hmm.
think, knowing that really is powerful, right? It informs, like, if you can do those things, then you can do them for good,
Yeah.
right?
So, looking ahead, what are the biggest opportunities and challenges for sports diplomacy in the next decade?
I think the opportunities are endless. I really do. I think there's
Mm-hmm.
nothing you can't do through sports and with sports. Just because literally
Mm-hmm.
sport, I think because sports and in football, we always talk about football because it is the world sport. And
Mm-hmm.
it is a pretty great sport in the way it's structured, right? But what sports does is it creates a community. And creating communities in a world where communities are disappearing really, really fast for so many reasons, right? I mean, so many reasons, is a hugely powerful tool, right? It's absolutely powerful tool. So just in that fact alone, that I think that there's a limitless possibilities for what sports can do on the ground, and but also what it can do diplomatically. I think the greatest challenge is, and I think it will come, but I think it's taking it's. So I sat in a and I'm not going to I sat in a UNESCO meeting recently, and the majority of the people in the room were wonderful people who were trying to make sports a thing. And I'm not going to sort of tell you exactly what it was, but they were trying to make sports part of programs, right? But the majority of them, even the ones who were there trying to make sports part of a program, never referenced sport as a tool. It was always referenced as sport is important because health is important, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's absolutely true. But also, like, there's no reason why sports can't come in with every other basic necessity as a tool for emotional health, as a tool for you know um, rehab, as a tool for. And I
Yeah.
think the challenge is having people understand that that's what it is, and having people understand it's going to happen, but it's having people take sports seriously as they take, like, food and shelter, right? Or anything else that you
Mm-hmm.
need. Like, yeah, first you need water and food, and you need shelter. And
Yeah.
but there's no reason why you can't bring water, food, shelter, and a ball, and start using, you right, sports as a tool for therapy, like, right away. Because a ball, like, not everybody, art therapy for me was my original sort of, sport, social impact tool. But
Mm-hmm.
not everybody's going to have paper and or chalk and pens, and but one ball or five balls, right? Anyone can bring five balls to a place. And while you're feeding and giving them water and shelter, like, you take some of the younger people to whatever, like, 5 foot square, piece of land, and you take a ball and you start healing. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's, I think the challenge is education, to educate people. And I hate that word because it sounds so pejorative, but the challenge is to, like, to make people aware that sports, should be part of all of that. That it's not like a side thing that you do once you get everybody safe, right? It doesn't, or it is, but it doesn't have to be. It can be, and
Mm-hmm.
in that way, it's a powerful tool for diplomacy, because anything that becomes a necessity becomes a powerful tool.
Yeah. Yeah. Agreed. Yeah. So, any initiatives or policy that you think should be implemented to maximize the positive impact of sports on society?
Yeah, I think we have to legislatively, globally, I think sports again has to become more important. I think the United States, honestly, even the
Hmm.
United States, my kids' public schools, they have, like, some of the schools have gym, like, once a week. Do you know what I mean? Because of funding, especially schools
Yeah.
in the most important places that need sports in the lower income areas of New York they don't have money for a gym teacher. It's not like math or science. And I think that's globally. Like, there's no soccer. There's very little. There's very to no sports for girls in, and maybe for any children, to be honest, in Brazil, but especially girls, because girls don't go to the beach and they're invited into those pickup games. You know what I mean? And so there are no sports, in public schools are not required to have sports in most places in the world.
Oh.
So I think that it has to be, like, here and here, top to bottom, bottom to top,
Hmm.
where
Yeah.
sports is seen as something as important as math, as important, right? Because also it is 1,000% an actual proven scientific fact that moving your body helps your brain, right?
Yeah.
That that, like, even in all of these neurological studies about learning, about retention, about material retention, it's been proven that, like, you learn, you walk, you learn, you walk, and that's how, like, things move from the frontal, to the back, like long-term memory part of your brain, right? So I feel like there needs to be more emphasis on, like, the core importance of moving your body. And
Mm,
also to look at sports. I think it's really important that, especially in the United States, because the United States is crazy about this, but to go back to looking at sports as play. We talk about playing sports, but we forget about the word play.
mm,
Like, sports isn't always, becoming an Olympiad. It doesn't have to be, I'm going to be in the World Cup, right? You should be
yeah,
playing whatever. You should be playing your whole life. You don't stop
yeah,
when you realize you're not going to go Division 1. Playing is an important part of learning. It's an important part of just surviving. So I think that those things
yeah,
have to become more part of the conversation.
yeah. That's actually a really important fact. Even out here in India, the awareness is just growing now regarding how important sports is in schools. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's a really
Globally, I think,
great
yeah,
fact.
it's interesting.
Yeah. So last question for the day. So if you could change one thing about the way sports diplomacy is currently used, what would it be and why?
I think it would be I think it would be that. I think it would be to center it more in all the conversations, and to center sports sports as a tool for social impact into the conversation of
Mm-hmm.
sports diplomacy. And I think it is, actually, the truth is, it's such a new concept, sports diplomacy,
Yeah.
that it always has to be explained. So I don't know that there needs to be a lot of change. I think we just have to make sure we take it in the right direction, because anything that can be used for good can also be used for bad, right? So I think it's to
Mm.
keep taking it in the right direction and keep focusing on, like, what it is that it's being used for and how it's being used. I think it's important to be careful also not to, again, to exploit players and exploit, for in the name of diplomacy. But yeah, I think that that's it. I don't know that I would change anything yet, because I don't think it's. I think my change would be to make it more, to center it more in conversations of diplomacy, to center it more in conversations of social impact, global social impact, right? And I think it is. I think it's going that way. So I don't know. You should ask me this in like 5 years. What would I change? 'Cause I think in 5 years it'll be much more. I think in 5 years we'll have all the good stuff that happens and all the bad stuff, and we can talk more
Yeah.
about what we would
Mm.
change.
Yeah. So I'll make sure to contact you in 5 years.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll send a little blurb.
Yeah. So I guess that's it for now. Thank you, Miss Nascimento, for joining us. Your insights truly meant a lot, and it's really important. The power that sport has to transform or change the world.
Yeah, it really is. And
So
I have to say, thank you, because I think one of the cool things about your podcast is that, like, there are not a lot of sports diplomacy podcasts. There are not a lot of people talking
yeah,
about sports diplomacy. In our world, we kind of feel like, yeah, of course everybody knows about it. It's not. This is like, I don't think I've ever been on a sports diplomacy podcast. For as much as I speak about sports diplomacy. So I think this is what you're doing is really important. So keep up the good work, and thank you for inviting me.
yes, we surely will do. Thank you so much.